You're watching Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Julia Kim. These are the headlines on the continent. From Hollywood hero to suspected terrorist, Paul Rusesabagina is refused bail by a Rwandan court. The high-profile government critic awaits trial on charges including terrorism and financing rebel groups. Catastrophic floods affect hundreds of thousands of people in South Sudan. We'll have the latest from the director of the World Food Programme in the country. And Uganda's forests are flourishing thanks to help from an unexpected source. Loggers will tell you how reforestation has taken off in a country that had lost over half its trees in recent decades. But first, Paul Rusesabagina, whose story inspired the film Hotel Rwanda, will stay behind bars. A Kigali court denied bail to Rusesabagina ahead of his trial. He's being charged with terrorism, financing rebel groups, murder and arson, among others. Rusesabagina had been living in exile for years but was arrested in Kigali in murky circumstances. Rights groups say this is just the latest example of the Rwandan government targeting its critics. Miquela Slachwayo has the latest.
Rusesabagina has lived in exile since the 1990s, where he became a critic of President Paul Kagame. He also joined political opposition and also expressed support for an armed struggle against the Rwandan government. Rusesabagina is a cancer survivor. Today, he cited his poor health for reasons to be granted bail. However, the judge said that he may sabotage the investigation and therefore needs to remain behind bars. Rusesabagina plans to appeal this decision. However, if convicted, he faces life in prison. Paul Rusesabagina is also a resident of the US, and American officials said that they are monitoring the situation. He also holds Belgian citizenship, and officials there said that they were not involved in his arrest. It's still not clear, however, how he ended up under arrest in Kigali. The opposition groups there, as well as his family, say that he was kidnapped in Dubai after flying in from his home in the US. The opposition groups say that they are routinely targeted all over the world. They say that the critics of the government and President Paul Kagame either end up killed or kidnapped within Rwanda or abroad.
Nigeria's northwestern Kaduna state is now home to the nation's strictest laws against rape. Men convicted of rape will face surgical castration, and anyone raping a child under 14 years old will face the death penalty. Reports of sexual assault have risen dramatically during the coronavirus lockdown in the country. Women's rights protests across the country had called for tougher punishments, including execution. Now, catastrophic floods have affected 500,000 people in South Sudan. One of the worst affected areas is the eastern state of Jonglei, where over 120,000 people have fled their homes. Prior to the flooding, recurring violence had forced the government to declare a state of emergency there last week. This, the pandemic, and the threat of waterborne diseases have pushed many deeper into hunger and poverty. Well, earlier we spoke to the World Food Programme South Sudan Country Director, Matthew Hollingworth. He had this to say.
Well, families that I've met for the last couple of days here in Jonglei have essentially been telling me that this flood and the impact of the flood is just compounding what's been an awful year for them. Many people were already displaced because of conflict this year. We've seen the worst fighting in Jonglei State this year for some 5 years or more. But also, people were affected by the COVID-19, secondary impacts on the economy. Things are much more expensive. Supply chains have been interrupted. But with displacement from conflict and now floods as well, they're really in a desperate situation.
What are the current challenges at the moment getting aid into those affected regions?
I mean, first of all, the floods have cut off the main arteries around Jonglei, which are always very tenuous anyway, given the paucity of infrastructure in this country. but this has made it much worse. It's also at a time when typically we're starting to come out of the lean season, the worst part of the year, when harvests from the previous season have run out and people are at the most desperate. But now should normally be a time of hope and joy because the new harvest starts to come in. But these floods have sort of decimated those harvests. A lot of the land that's cultivated or that was cultivated is underwater. So people are in a really difficult situation. And we're having to respond quickly to provide immediate needs for them, but also start looking to the longer term because we know they're going to be starting the new season with very little in hand in terms of their own produce.
Now, you touched upon this earlier, the wide-scale flooding on top of weeks of armed violence. It prompted South Sudan to announce a state of emergency in Jonglei earlier last week. What else has the government been doing in response?
I mean, right now the government's got its hands full for sure. The peace deal in South Sudan, in terms of the country, is writ large, is holding. But what we have seen is increasing amounts of conflict in places like Jonglei, and in fact, that conflict has been for the last 6 months, not only the last few weeks, and bubbling over and persistently getting worse. But we're also seeing conflict in other parts of the country. So this sub-national level of conflict takes away their focus from issues like this, as does the economy, which is in free fall. The Sudanese pound, the South Sudanese pound, is falling day by day. There's not enough hard currency in the country. They're not making the funds that they would normally hope to be making from the oil that they can export. And so the economy is just much, much worse. What we've seen, though, and what's heartening for me in the last couple of days is really how the local authorities are responding, how the communities are getting together to work. I mean, I met with 500 young people today who have been working since 8 o'clock in the morning. They're still working now at 6 o'clock in the evening to rebuild one of the dikes, one of the 3 dikes that burst in the capital city of Jonglei, which has meant that half the entire town is underwater, is knee-deep in water.
Now, let's just talk quickly about coronavirus, because of obviously that situation being exacerbated by all this flooding. How has the country been dealing with the outbreak?
Well, I mean, the coronavirus is just one of many, many, many challenges that people of South Sudan face. There are already chronic sicknesses, illnesses here, all over this country, and acute problems like malnutrition and food insecurity as well. So COVID-19 is just something else. It's another worry. And frankly, I mean, again, I spoke to people who told me, they wouldn't know if anybody in their community had died because of COVID or was sick because of COVID, because it feels and looks just like the flu. It's very similar to malaria, and both upper respiratory tract infections and malaria are so incredibly common in what is the state that has the SUDs, the largest wetlands in South Sudan and one of the largest wetlands in the world. So for them, COVID-19 is something else. What we have seen, though, in the country is it has had a massive impact on food and other items prices in the markets. Anything that has to come in from outside has been impacted because of COVID-19. It's slowing down the trucking from outside the country, trucking from other countries of vital commodities. That's the bigger impact from what we are seeing.
That was Matthew Hollingworth speaking to us there from the World Food Programme in South Sudan. And finally, we talk a lot about deforestation, but in Uganda, reforestation has taken off. Over 20 years of intensive farming and illegal logging had whittled away forest cover by more than half. But since 2015, the decline has not only stopped, it's reversed. That's thanks to a policy that relies on loggers. They've been encouraged to plant trees as buffers next to protected forests. Laurent Bachtecker has this report.
A lush green canopy harboring giant hardwood trees that seem to reach up to the heavens. Over the past few years, Uganda's reforestation program has helped the Mpanga forests recapture some of its former glory.
Several incentives were thought about, including putting aside land in central forest reserves for afforestation.
In 2005, Uganda's National Forestry Association allocated some 200,000 hectares to private logging companies as part of a nationwide reforestation strategy. 15 years on, nearly half of that surface is now covered in trees. These forests, which are home to several endangered species, also act as carbon sinks and can help reduce much of the country's energy demands.
If you don't have health forests that can help you form the needed rain to support agriculture, then you will have to invest heavily into the irrigation.
Yet with electricity in Uganda among the most expensive in Africa, 90% of its population continues to rely on firewood for energy.
ne tuba nkituleetera okuwalanya ennyo ebibira biri obufu obwasigalawo ne tuba ntubukozesa nnyo.
Widespread timber consumption saw Uganda lose nearly half of its forests between 1990 and 2015. But over the past 5 years, trees have begun to grow again, with authorities now aiming to double the country's forested surface by 2040.
And that's it from us here on Eye on Africa. There's more news coming up. Stay tuned to France 24.